Greetings and salutations, YouTube viewers. Welcome back. Today's offering, as you can tell by the title, will be Chapter 1 of my new book, Red Star Sheriff. Now, I'm going to try to throw some voice work in this and try to make it as entertaining as possible, partner. What's this book about, you might be asking? Well, this book follows the adventures of a young woman by the name of Idale Wilson. Her father has just been murdered and she's out for a quest of revenge. Seems a little cliche, but this quest for revenge is only Chapter 1. She gets her revenge. But what happens next is the true meat and bones of the story. That's where it really takes off. So, her father has written this journal, and these guys from the Union, General Samuel Trevor Barracks and President Eldridge Lee, want to get a hold of this journal real bad, because inside this journal are details and schematics for new technologies that could alter the balance of power in the colonies. Ooh. Yeah. Right now, this particular book is the first book of 3. There will not be any more than 3. It's designed to be a trilogy because there's just so much to the story that I can't just work it into one book. So this basically is essentially a a chase book. Those stories where you had a chase going on in it. But of course, there's more to it than just that. So without further ado, without padding this any further, let's get into the first part of Red Star Sheriff. Okay. Act 1. Chapter 1. Revenge. The hand around her neck pressed her face harder into the filth-encrusted wall of brick and mud. She tried to stifle the sob threatening to rack her body as a calloused hand crawled up her thigh, sliding her frilled satin dress upwards to her waist. Her eyes clenched tighter and the sobbing broke through. A brief aside, this is in her head. "Oh, please don't rip my dress. Whatever you do to me, don't damage it. It's all I got left of my mama." A foul breath, thick with garlic and whiskey, caressed her right cheek as a grizzled face drew close to her ears. "Now quit your whimpering. You and I both know how much you're gonna enjoy this." His hand reached up, grabbed her undergarments, and yanked so hard the rip echoed wall to wall for several heart-wrenching seconds. A hungry chuckle rolled out, and he slowly rubbed the front of his pants against her buttocks. The enlarging bulge set her on a path to screaming. Before she could let it loose, though, hot liquid splattered across her face, dousing her hair in the process. A gurgled plea fell forth as his grip gave and his body hit the ground with a dull, thick thud. Lilybell opened her eyes and spun around. Her blonde, blood-soaked locks clung to her face like a wet, terrified cat. Her bonnet slid down her neck and hung by its ties, hands whipped to her chest. Her attacker lay on his back, throat slit, body convulsing, chest sucking in his final breaths. His last rasping protest ceased. Her heart was pounding, but a strange sense of satisfaction brought on a vicious grin as she watched his death knell. All of his kind disgusted her, and it was the least that he deserved. That grizzled tan visage, his shit-covered shirt, his twitching ochre boots, all of it reviled her. Even that mass of chestnut hair flickering in the sandy breeze. Lilybell forced herself to look away from the quivering mass and towards her brave savior, only to find a woman not even quite as tall as herself. Brick-red skin, flowing raven black hair hanging wildly from beneath a dirty, crimson-red brimmed hat. A calf-length leather duster, equally dirty, equally red, billowed out behind her, and in the woman's right hand, an impossibly large serrated knife dripping with the assailant's blood. The woman in red held the blade outward, not quite horizontal, but in a manner that suggested if the bastard tried to get back up, it was going to be driven deep into his gullet and twisted. There was a shallow shadow cast across the woman in red's brow line. Focused, narrowed eyes, fierce and onyx, stared hard at the body and studied the rest of the alley. Cracked lips and hard vertical lines belied her young visage. A tingle ran up Lilybell's spine, and she opened her mouth to say something, anything, when gruff voices, jesting and braying, came sauntering down the alleyway head. "Hey, Gil, how long you gonna take to—" "Oh, shit!" The two men reached for their guns. In her head. "Well?" Lilybell let a sigh slip loose. "It was nice while it lasted." However, in the time it took to form a cross over her chest, and those men's weapons to come to bear, the woman in red had dropped her heavy blade, which fell straight down to pierce the groin of the dead man. He didn't seem to mind. He wasn't using them anymore anyway. Pulled both of her enormous revolvers and fired 2 shots that tore through those men like they were wet paper. In her head. "Oh!" Lilybell leapt back a step, seeing a bright light and being rattled by the fiercest explosion she had ever heard a gun make. The smell of copper and electricity filled the air. One outlaw's head erupted in a fountain of blood and gore. What was left of his shredded body flopped into the ground in a wet, slurpy splat. The second man took a blast to the chest and received a similar fate. The only difference being, his bloody mass went careening into the wall behind him, giving a fresh paint of viscera and brain matter. His arms, meanwhile, made an effort of escape back down the alley. They didn't get very far. Maybe too much. The woman in red muttered and thumbed what looked to Lilybell like 2 small flat discs on the inner pistol grips of those lethal widowmakers. In her head. "Oh dear, oh dear." Lilybell fanned herself with her hand, yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the bits of shredded meat, the pools of blood covering just about everything, the organs snaking across the dirty, dusty ground, rolling around in a muck like dropped sausage at the county fair. The sheer gore of the scene, the violence. Something clicked in her head. A glimmer of some new emotion she never knew she could feel. Her head grew light. Her vision drew far away. A pulsing sensation said, none of this is real. But there she stood, in the middle of a truth she was only now coming to understand. In her head. This is what justice looks like. The sort of justice that these cowards fear. A smile crept across her lips and her eyes widened at the thought of it all. She looked to the woman in red, parted her lips to thank her, sing her praises, hail the gods and the stars for delivering this bastion of justice to her. Instead, the woman in red grabbed Lilybell by the shoulder and shoved her towards a flight of stairs that, somewhere in the back of Lilybell's mind, she knew led into the back room of the general store. Her feet had trouble finding purchase as she was forced up the stairs, her mind reeling, her words failing. "You get on up in there and don't come out till the shooting's done stopped," the woman in red railed in her ears. Thank you, goddess of vengeance. You saved my life, punished the wicked, brought back true law to this town who's forgotten what that is," were all words she hoped to say, but all that came out was heavy grunting breaths. As she was pushed forward, she raced to the top of the stairs, free of the woman in red's grip. Once at the top, she looked back towards the alley, seeing the total scene of the aftermath in all its vicious glory. And there was the woman in red. She was no longer looking at Lilybell, but rather checking her rounds, spinning their chambers along her thighs, and then racing towards the main street where the dead man's friends had come clomping towards them, expecting an easy time, and finding only oblivion instead. Justice! The woman in red's duster trailed behind her, beating out a funeral dirge for those unlucky or stupid enough to be caught in her crosshairs. In her head. "Godspeed, my lady. Godspeed." Lilybell smiled and waved. Then the explosive force of the woman in red's harbingers of death started back up, and Lilybell fled inside. Idale held her weapons out at arm's length. Each weighed no more than 5 pounds, yet both could deliver a shot with the force of a cannonball fired at the speed of light. Red tubes ran the silver barrels from tip to hilt. Every time she pulled the trigger, they glowed like soldered steel. She called them her irons, though their construction was of a considerably rarer element. They were as long as her forearm and half as thick, yet the built-in kinetic regulators allowed her to wield them as if they were little more than water pistols. Those cold ferrymen were mementos of him, their creator. And it was because of him she had come to Rented City. It was because of her father's death that 30 bastards had to die. The wind kicked in hard as she exited the alleyway. Dust blew down the dirty street while 2 men saw her and took cover by water barrels outside of the jailhouse. Idale thumbed a disc on her irons halfway and fired. The revolvers made a satisfying hum just before they discharged their specialized rounds. The barrel in front of one man exploded into a cloud of water, wood, and blood, sending him flying backwards into the building wall and through the jailhouse window, his torso shredded flesh. More shots rang out as the other man peeked out of cover to open up on her position. She leapt to her left and into the cover of a trough. Bullets buried deep. The water inside streamed out tiny hose. Idale popped back up and returned fire. Another barrel destroyed, another bloody mess. She thumbed the inner disc back a quarter and looked around the streets. She knew there were more out there, could hear some of them yelling to one another. They were coming and coming fast. She needed better cover, or this little quest of hers is going to come to a sudden and painful end. In her head, "Tally time, girl." She saw a stairwell outside of a tailor shop and rushed towards it. Took out those 2 lookouts entering town. That fuck trying to have his way with that girl. His 2 friends and these losses. Okay, 7 down, 23 to go, including the big boss himself, Kern fucking Michaels. I'm coming for you son bitch. She hit the top of the stairwell and found a throughway to an open balcony. Beyond was an alleyway to her right. On the left, doors to a series of apartments. She knelt down by the balcony rail. A crossbeam nearby connected across the alley to another building. It would be a narrow walk, but was as good a way as any. Idale furrowed her brow and ran a hand across her forehead. She clenched her eyes and sighed deeply. Footsteps echoed loudly in the crunching dirt. She opened her eyes and grabbed the iron resting on her thigh. 2 men walked slowly into view, their guns at the ready. She raised her iron and aimed, firing twice. Both headshots. 9. Getting to her feet, Idale mounted a crossbeam and balanced her way across. As she reached her destination, more yelling rang out, convincing her to duck down once more. 3 more men ran into the alley. They stopped at the still twitching corpses of the former colleagues. "Oh, balls, Lou, what we gonna do?" The man questioned and gripped his hair with a free hand, staring down at the headless bodies. "I tells you what we should do. Fuck this, hightail it out of town, make for the hills." "You stole that talk, Maris. Just one little gal with a burr up her ass. There's more than enough of us left to put her down." Maris walked in a tight circle around the 2 dead men. His hands waved animatedly. His eyes narrowed and spit flew from his mouth. "Look around you, Lou. 2 more dead, and I hear more's out the other side of town. Hell, I heard someone done went and did into Sentries, and those were the John boys. Anyone just come in and take them down? I don't want to mess with. Ain't that right, Elson?" "I don't know, Maris, but shit, maybe we should get out of town, Lou." "Both you 2 knock that shit off." Lou pointed his gun at the dead men. "Now we're gonna find that little bitch and we're gonna—" Idale rolled her eyes. She popped up, brought both her irons forward, and unloaded on all 3. Elson flew back into a pile of garbage, and Lou's head erupted. Maris took 2 shots to his shoulder before ducking beneath a painter's scaffold. "Elson!" Maris cried out, watching the young man gurgle his last breath and go still. He fired blindly up at Idale, forcing her back into cover. "She's up in the old whorehouse!" Maris shouted at the top of his lungs and heard half a dozen angry responses. Idale cursed under her breath. Looking around, she knew she had little time. To the left and right were windows. Behind her, a corridor ran into the building. She ran through the upper entrance and down the hallway, passing 4 doors. As she neared a stairwell at the far end, 3 men came thundering up. She aimed her irons, dropping back a doorway, and opened fire on the men as they lumbered into the hall. She dropped 2 of them, while the last took cover behind a wall and fired around the corner. She growled and pushed into a room with her left shoulder, slamming the door shut behind her. Beside her was a bookcase that looked made of solid oak and full of books. Putting all her might into it, she pushed the whole unit over until it crashed in front of the doorway. It wouldn't hold the men out indefinitely, but she was certain it would be just long enough. There was a window, and she prayed it opened out to another building. Whimpering came from a walk-in closet as Idle passed, and she stopped to see 2 women sitting on the floor holding one another. They looked at her and their grips tightened. Thumping came from behind, and Idle looked back to see dust being pounded off the blocked door as Kern's men shouted and cursed, trying to burst inward. She turned to the 2 women and held up a hand. "You ladies stay put now. No matter what you hear, don't leave this closet." They nodded just as fast as their heads could manage as Adelaide headed towards the window. She saw a short jump to a single-story roof and leapt out to run across. Getting to the edge, she leapt over to a stairwell. 3 men ran below, looking up as she made the jump. "She's heading to the saloon! She's headed!" His head blew off as she fired a name for the others. 1 man fired back, lodging his shots into the wood of the stairs she crouched upon. Idle blasted his rear shoulders as he fled. He tried to stand back up from his sprawl, but 2 more shots into his back put him down for good. The last man managed to escape. A grumble escaped her lips as she pushed up and rushed into the saloon, hearing the voices of angry men closing in. Matthew Kyle raced into the bank, yelling at the top of his lungs in a panic that Kern Michaels just didn't care for. They might be considered outlaws, but there was a certain decorum one exhibited when expressing one's fears. Matthew failed in every account of his expectations. "She's here, Kern, she's here! The boys done saw her, that bitch from Jury, and she's picking us off one by one. I just barely got away with my life." Kern turned from the counter where he and his crew were loading up bags of coin and minerals. He braced his hands on his hips and screwed up his face, his thick mustache accentuating a menacing snarl. There were strands of gray in that mustache, and the stubble lining his grizzled jaw. The weight of decades was in his eyes as he stared at the young man wilting under his gaze. No, Matt wasn't living up to his expectations at all. "What you hollering about?" "Ain't you heard, Mr. Michaels? That Wilson girl's tearing through our crew, gun for her everywhere, and ain't nobody can get a bead on her neither." Wilson. He narrowed his eyes and looked around the small town bank. They'd only been in Rented City about 2 days, and he hadn't expected word to have already traveled far and wide where they were. 2 weeks earlier, that young woman had caused him a headache out in Jury, killing 5 of his men. He thought he'd convinced her to give up all that revenge nonsense over her father, but he guessed he'd been wrong about her self-righteous determination. He thought just letting her go had been his recompense for screwing that job up so bad, and now she was back, not having gotten the merit of his generosity. Well, that was okay. His crew was a bunch of seasoned killers. Well, maybe not Matthew. And could handle one scrawny Chehookan girl. In his head, can't they? He scowled and looked back to the young man. "Ain't nobody been able to corner her?" "No, sir. Well, not really. Me and Brent and Mikey came up under her jumping over the saloon stairwell. She took him and Mikey down without even a breath. Never seen such fast shooting. I mean..." "All right, shut it." Kern lifted his hand and furrowed his brows. "You go get the rest of the boys to keep her pinned down up in there. Get 'em together fast before she comes to her senses and skips out. I'll be up there shortly. And don't go getting flustered. You ain't doing any of us any good running around like a startled pussy." "Yes, sir, Mr. Michaels." The young man turned and ran out of the bank doors. Kern heard him shouting the second he exited to get the crew to the saloon. In his head, "Nope. Definitely ain't cut out for this life for that one. First things first, though." Kern turned to the 5 crew members with him in the bank. They'd stopped loading the bags of the broad handcart and were staring at him in expectation. They'd been hankering for a real fight for weeks. The local law just hadn't met their cravings and had gone down easy and fast. And now Ms. Wilson was back for a rematch. In turn, the bank workers tied up in the corner looked at one another and then Kern with a nervous trepidation, kerchiefs in their mouths stifling any words. Maybe, Kern reflected, they were just waiting for the right person to put his head on a bike. He couldn't say he could blame them for the sentiment. After all, the day was still young and Wilson was a real hellcracker. Not a woman who went down as easy as the local law enforcers, which was one of the reasons he let her go to begin with, if he was being honest with himself. A frown crossed his face and his head. Beginning to wish I never heard of that Sam Barracks fella. Well, you heard the boy. Get your asses in gear so as we can show young Miss Wilson a good old time. If she's in the saloon, we'll have a real good chance of trapping her up in there. Only 2 ways out, so you're out back when we get there. Got it? They all nodded and headed out. Kern followed, his hand never leaving the butt of his sidearm, a tense dread clawing up his spine. Idly jumped through an open window around the back of the saloon and stood in the middle of a room where 2 men hunkered down at a tiny table in the corner playing a hand of cards. They looked at her, their expressions ones of terror. One of the white-haired old men swallowed hard as he spoke. Miss, I'd just as soon not be involved in this if you don't mind. She tugged on the brim of her gray lance hat. You gents don't mind me, just passing through. Adelaide exited the room and was met with hollering from all across the saloon. She frowned as she slowed to a walk, irons held before her, and gazed to the floor. In her head, how many did I take down? 13? No, 15. Shit. She pondered, counted down the bodies laying to waste in her head. Half down, 15 to go. Damn. And they all know I'm here now. She hurried down the hall and darted into her room that was at the front of the saloon's 2nd floor. At the window, she knelt down. In the open street below, a dozen men were taking cover surrounding the saloon. Where are the others? Where the hell is Kern? They had to be around back. Kern had her cornered. Not how she imagined this day going. And once again, your dumbass gets stuck in a bind. Then, there he was, strolling out into the clearing just across the street, as if this were just an ice cream social. Miss Wilson, he called out and came to a stop between 2 of his men, hands resting on his revolvers. I assume that's you causing all this ruckus. Don't gotta be this way, you know. Why don't you come on out and we discuss this civilly? She squinted, her brows knitting deeply. Her lips drew taut and she lifted her iron. The shot blasted through an electric pole, taking his hat off. Lucky fuck. I'm guessing you ain't in a talking mood, he caustically shouted, recovering from his hasty duck, then looked to his men still remaining. Well, what you waiting for? Get on up in there. His henchmen hesitantly looked at him and reluctantly pushed towards the saloon. Idly smiled, dialed back her iron for a clean shot, and filled a man with 1 discharge. She didn't get another, as a volley of fire rang the window and she was forced out of the room to seek better cover. Saloon patrons were running every which way as she re-entered the corridor. There was a poker room acting as a connecting juncture to the upstairs rooms, and the balcony overlook of the tavern itself. Entering in a crouch, Idly made her way over to the opposite doorway overlooking the downstairs tavern. 11 angry outlaws rushed in, flipping over tables to seek cover behind them, the bar, and support pillars. There was no way she was going to be able to put them down from her position, especially Kern, who was cowering behind one of those pillars. Maybe I can get a shot at him from the other side of the overlook. No good. They're headed to the stairs, so 11 in here. The remaining 3 must be out back. Les Maris and that one swift-footed Garnet done headed for the hills. Patrons rushed out behind the gang as 5 men split off and ran under the balcony. This left 6 men in the saloon foyer. There was almost a sigh of relief out of her. Almost. With 6 in the foyer, 8 were still in play out of sight. Think, woman, think. How do we handle this? Wilson, Kern shouted. Why are you hiding now? Thought you had unfinished business with me. Don't worry, cocksucker. I ain't escaping. It's you and me, Buttercup, and at least one of us is leaving in a body bag. She let a dark smile creep across her face. "First, I gotta dance with your little buddies." "Maybe she just runned off, out the back," a man at the end of the bar muttered. "Nah, she ain't running. Edge's pot's got the rear with some crew sides. Stairwell's covered too. Even if she wanted to run, she ain't going nowhere." Kern chuckled. There was creaking coming from behind her, and Idale took in a deep breath. They were doing a room-by-room search for her. Every skill she'd learned, every scenario she'd prepared for, was about to be put to the test. Keeping out of sight, she ducked behind a sofa and waited. There were 4 ways into the poker room. One out to the balcony where there was the twin stairwell leading to the tavern floor, and she knew no one was coming up there. After all 6 men were waiting for her to be stupid enough to come down guns blazing. Another exit was to a hallway just behind where she crouched. The other 2 formed an intersection at the poker hall where she waited. Kern's men would be coming from all 3 directions. She was sure of it and could hear a few now. The men below would be waiting to see if she was flushed out. That satisfaction would just have to wait. There would be a matter of seconds to react. Her best bet was a quick culling of their herd in one shot, and she had no idea how many would be clustered together hunting her down. The creak grew louder. A gun came into view from the corridor nearest her, and one of Kern's men walked quietly into the room. She removed her hand from her revolver grip and reached for the blade in one weathered boot. It was 8 inches long and razor sharp. She leapt upward and ran that blade across his throat, blood spurting outward. He raised his hands, dropping his piece. "Here she is!" a voice cried out behind her. In that same moment, she allowed the man in her grip to crumple to the floor, flipped the blade into her palm, and turned around to toss it at the man coming up the hallway. The blade caught him in his eye, tipped first, before he could even pull his trigger. She drew both her irons and fired at 2 men following him. Before any of them could hit the floor, she heard thumping and cocking of guns from the opposite end of the poker room and turned around, thumbing the disc on her left iron to the halfway mark. She targeted a man across the foyer, taking aim. 2 shots zipped through her duster, just missing her body as she returned fire. The expelled round hit the first man, causing him to explode into an inferno. The man behind him caught fire and thrust himself against the wall, screaming. Thumbing down the disc again, she fired, his head erupting into a volcano of gore. The hallway went up in flames as the corridor walls started collapsing in on themselves. Shit. So much for doing as little damage as possible. Down in the tavern, Kern and his crew had their hands to their faces as wood was falling from the ceiling. One chandelier fell to the floor from its hitches. Timber collapsed into one of the men trying to flee down a back stairwell and into the tavern. The building was still quaking from the blast. "Fuckballs! Boys!" Kern called out. "What the hell was that? What's going on up there?" Idale stepped backwards into the hallway behind her and reloaded her irons. The dead man at her feet almost caused her to trip. Her blade was still sticking out of his eye. There was no need to retrieve it. She had 5 blades remaining in all, 2 in her boots, 3 in her inner pockets, all ready to be thrown. The first thing was first. She popped a cylinder out of its chamber and shoved it into the amble cup on her belt to be reused later. From another cup, she pulled a loaded cylinder and pushed it into the iron's waiting chamber. The cylinder spun and she prepared to move on, listening for more yelling to get closer. The flames across the way were growing larger and fiercer. Idale's thoughts. "Way to go, dipshit. Hope this place stays standing long enough. Elsewise, Kern might just head outside and watch you get burnt out." A door opened behind her and a pair of hands grabbed her and pulled her inside the room. She was tossed into a bed, her irons flying across the room into motion. She got a look at the man, a bloody wound to his shoulder and hip, snarl plastered across his grizzled features. "Why, hello, Maris." Idale thrust out her foot, nailing him in the groin before he could respond, and as he reached over, she dropped down to grab her guns. Maris recovered before she was able to reach them and grabbed her by the throat, forcing her back to the bed. This time, she managed to get her feet under her, leapt up and flipped over him. Twisting in the air, she grabbed his head and came down with all her force, pulling his head onto the spiked bedpost on the end. The spike drove straight through his eye and out the back of his head. She got back to her knees and looked at his twitching body hanging off the bedpost like a worm on a hook. She picked up her revolvers and headed out the back door to the room and to another hallway running the back half of the saloon. Out in the fresh corridor, a man was headed towards her way. She ducked back inside and behind a door and waited until he was inside the room looking at the body. "Look, where?" Adelaide came out behind the door and shoved a blade deep into his neck. He dropped his gun and reached up to grab the blade and pull it out. However, she held on with a vicious grip. "Don't worry, I'll lead," she said, twisting the blade and eliciting a sort of gargled scream. She led him out of the room and down the hallway, keeping him from falling over, his eyes already glazing over. Here she found a secondary stairwell that she'd seen running for cover not even 10 minutes before. It led right down behind the bar itself. Kern was screaming his head off. He was angry, and he was scared. The satisfaction of hearing it in his voice made her even more determined to see this through, come hell or high water. 6 left. "Boys!" Kern called out. Engulfing flames in the second story were filling the saloon with the sounds of crackling wood, falling timber, breaking glass, and the smell of acrid smoke. They weren't making any effort to come up after her, nor were they leaving despite the worried protests of his crew. "What's going on? She dead?" "We need to leave, Kern. The whole place is coming down." "Not till I know the little wench is dead." "She'll be dead soon, Kern." "Sorry, Kern. Your boys had better things to do up here and better afterlives to do 'em in," Adelaide called back with a smile. The man she had by the scruff of the neck and bleeding throat was dying fast and wouldn't be much use much longer. "Not yet, sugar. Almost, though. Then you can rest the rest of the wicked." The saloon rattled and Kern screamed out. "So what next, Wilson? You expect us to just let you rock out the front door, call it quits? Or we all gonna perish here together?" Adelaide laughed. "Nope, I'm coming down, Kern. Now we finish this." "Well, come on, then." She leaned forward, not letting her grip slip off the knife or the collar of the outlaw. They went careening down the stairs, 2 at a time, flames starting to kiss this half of the building. Adelaide almost fell twice. At the bottom, Kern and his remaining men opened fire. She let go of the man being pelted by gunfire, slid over the bar at her side, firing as she went, taking 2 shots to the shoulder and hip, but downing one of the outlaws in the process. As she slid over the countertop, another of Kern's cronies raced up to shoot down at her. She thumbed the disc on her left iron and fired through the bar. The wood splintered into a spray of tiny shards, and the explosion caused the outlaw there to be shot backwards out the front window onto the surrounding deck. The bullet stopped flying, and Kern growled. His 2 remaining associates whimpered but didn't make the break. A large part of the rear of the saloon collapsed, blocking off the back exits. 3 left. She leaned back against the inner bar wall, her body throbbing. There was a wound to her shoulder, thigh, and hip. If she didn't finish Kern now, she wouldn't even be hobbling out of town, let alone leaving the saloon before it finally burned down. She felt her inner pocket inside. It didn't feel damaged. The little splitter her father had created in her head. "Finish them, girl, or you don't deserve to walk out of here." "Hot damn, woman, you can shoot," Kern sighed. "Let's finish this." She heard Kern grunt as he and his last 2 men stood up from where they'd taken cover and walked to the center of the room. The clump of their boots stopped. The flames were a roaring symphony as she looked up, saw the ceiling was a raging inferno. Now or never. She placed the edge of her muzzle flat against her forehead, pushing her gray lance up just a bit. The other she reholstered. She wasn't going to need it now. "What you say, Wilson? You got spirit, give you that." He let out a loud, sighing grunt and made his voice louder as the baluster started popping out of the rails they were holding up. "You know, killing your pappy tweren't nothing personal." Adelaide gave a humorless laugh and shook her head. "Was to me." She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out the splitter. She nodded and took in a deep breath. "You can do this." "I gotta go sometime. Might as well go with our boots on," Kern spat out. She nodded. "Can't argue with that philosophy, you bastard." In a blur of motion, Idly pushed herself to her feet, bringing the small round object to bear, and tossed it towards them. Nearly an instant later, she brought up her one pistol as Kern and his men took aim. Time froze. Flaming debris fell from the ceiling. Her enemy's guns raised higher. Her arms still extended from tossing her instrument in final reckoning forward as the splitter divided in half, approaching the outlaws. Each side became little spinning discs that sunk into each henchman's chest on either side of Kern and detonated with the force of a grenade. Their guts sprayed all over Kern, forcing him to cover his face, and then Idly fired 4 shots, one disarming him, one into his left shoulder, one into his belly, and one just above his heart. Kern went sprawling backwards to land hard on his back. A piece of burning paper landed on his face, singeing his mustache, and he howled, staring up at the roiling ceiling as smoke filled his eyes. Idly walked towards the former outlaw, deliberately slow, mindless of the carnage taking place around her, and kicked his weapon out of reach. She held her iron towards him, its surface glittering from the flames now seeking out the supporting walls of the foundation. Kern gave a nod and smiled with a cough. His grizzled and heavily mustached face were covered in blood and spittle. The fire that had sputtered on his whiskers winked out of existence. "Well, what you waiting for? Guess what you came for?" He coughed a slight chuckle. "The fool with my crew and you mow through us like hell's fury. Color me impressed, Miss Wilson." A scowl crossed her face. "Don't want your accolades. Only thing I want is you looking me in the eyes as I do you in." He lifted his head and fixed her with his gaze. "You can do with me what you will, but they ain't never gonna forget about that." A shot rang out, and his face shattered under the force. She stood there a moment, the lifeblood of Kern, her father's murderer, the savage who terrorized the sutures, pouring out of that hole in his face like a dam had burst. She holstered her iron, never taking her eyes off of his corpse. "Didn't say nothing about talking neither." Idly turned and walked towards the saloon exit, the building interior giving in to the devouring fire. Every step was a symphony of pain. She tried not to let it show, but the hobble was impossible to avoid as she walked through the doors and stopped. Onlookers were staring at her, the whole street filled with Kern's victims, all trying to avoid the burning building as smoke billowed outward through windows upstairs. A dinging bell signaled that they had called for the water truck. Most of the people weren't as fixated on the saloon, though. They just seemed shocked and full with the haze that it was really over. Some cheered as she continued onward. Some scowled and spoke quietly to one another that they loved that saloon and weren't looking forward to the rebuilding. Idly said nothing, only headed in the direction of her horse near the entrance of town. She was tired, hurt, and just done from her little war. Then there was still quite the ride ahead of her, and she'd probably have to stop and give herself a field wrap so she didn't bleed out. But that was for when she was out of town. After. The sounds of the collapsing saloon followed her down the town streets, as did several of the locals who were far more interested in her than the loss of their favorite watering hole. It had been quiet for far too long. Then the cheers had begun. She wasn't sure what that meant, but Lilybell decided to venture outside from where she had hidden in the general store's storeroom. The gunfire had long since stopped, and now was probably as good a time as ever to head back out into the alleyway. As she walked down the stairs, there was a din from a crowd of people rushing down the street. Her assailants from before were still lying where they fell, and she took care not to step on them or their drying blood as she headed out towards the alleyway entrance. As she exited, a group of women went rushing by. "What happened?" A woman in a bonnet by the name of Gretchen turned to her and took her shoulders. Lilybell thought about pulling away. After all, they weren't exactly friends. But Gretchen's excitement was so palpable, she found herself entranced. "You didn't hear, Lilybell? Kern Michaels and his gang are dead. We're free." Gretchen laughed in Lily Bell's face, causing spit to fly into her eye, and then turned to her friends and walked away. Lily Bell scowled and wiped her eye. Whore. She followed the throngs of people down the dusty streets to see what had happened. Smoke was rising into the air somewhere beyond the main street, out near the tavern. Her brow furrowed. She hated this town, hated the people in it, all save for her mother, who had brought them here out of fear of her grandfather. But her mother was dead now, dead because of this damn town. But even so, she supposed she had to be happy about the news. The last several days had been hell. Probably wouldn't fix how abusive her foster home was, though. He's dead, Lily Bell whispered and saw a familiar figure crossing the street where the people were congregating. It was the woman who had saved her from Kern's thugs. The woman in red. Lily Bell made her way down the long street to the far side of town. Dozens of citizenry were whooping it up, carrying on, waving their hats, praising the woman in red. To Lily Bell, she seemed broken and hurt, yet still walked with the gait of a hardened gunslinger. And that same thrill from earlier settled in Lily Bell's gut, causing her to quicken her pace. To meet this heroic woman, who put her life on the line for them, was the only driving force in her body. However, there wasn't any way to get any closer to the woman in red. There were just too many people clustered up in the middle of the streets. But she could see the mayor, that coward who'd hidden himself away during all of this, rushing up to the woman who'd mounted her horse near the eastern entrance and was angling out of town. Lily Bell stood across the street from them and watched on her tippy toes, mesmerized and awed. "Miss! Miss!" the mayor cried out and stopped in front of the woman. She offered up an expression that said, "Hurry it up. You done us all a great favor, and be honored to offer you the badge of sheriff, given that damn Kern wiped out our lawmen when he rode in. We need strong, law-minded individuals such as yourself taking care of business." The woman in red frowned at the smiling mayor. "I'm glad I could be of help, sir, but this was about a justice no one else seemed willing to dispense. I wish you luck in finding a sheriff, though." She began to ride away, but he stepped in front of her horse again. At least tell us the name. We're a brave hunter." A pregnant pause. Then, Adelaide Wilson. "Three cheers for Miss Adelaide Wilson," the mayor shouted to the crowd. "Hip, hip, hooray!" The crowd joined in and then shouted twice more as the woman in red shook her head and rode onward. Lily Bell took a step back, surprised. The woman was headed her way. Lily Bell looked up at her and caught her eyes as she rode by. "Thank you. I'll never forget what you've done here." The woman in red tugged on the brim of her hat. "Ma'am?" And with that, the woman kicked her mount into motion and headed out of town. Lily Bell watched her silhouette against the reddening sky, waited until the woman in red had disappeared into the distant sutures beyond, and still stood there long after the townspeople had dispersed. Justice. No one else seemed willing to dispense. That's what she said. One day soon, I'm going to be just like her. I'm going to dispense the justice nobody else seemed willing to deliver. I'll be the one they will be afraid to take advantage of. I'll be the one that makes them run the other way. Because justice, true justice, is what keeps the monsters awake at night. Woo-wee! Well, if you made it this far and you got all the way to the end here and you listened to the entire thing, I wanna thank you for listening to Chapter 1. You are a brave soul and a determined soul. That means you're interested. And if you're interested, well, you know what? That means you'd like this. And well, hopefully it means you like this, and I like to think that as a consequence, you're gonna go ahead and go pick up that book. Go buy it now. That way you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for new postings of these to go up. Go buy the book. Check out some of my other stuff I got going on too at my author's site. You can go over there right now. Hey, you don't even have to wait. You already heard the first chapter. You can see what comes next. You don't have to wait however long it's going to take for the next chapter to be made available. No, you don't. You can go buy it now. But really, I appreciate you sticking around. I appreciate you listening to all this. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to enjoy what I have to offer. I also hope you enjoyed my faux Sam Elliott voice. I don't know why I decided to read it in that manner. I have no idea why I decided to read it in that manner, but I did. I did because it seemed the most natural thing. Also, my female's voices I know are a little disconcerting because I'm not a female. And I do not have the voice program that allow me to alter my voice to sound like a female. Also, I am not entirely certain what Idly sounds like. I know that she is a person of Native American heritage, and I know that she was raised out in the sutures of the wastelands. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she always spent a lot of time around some of these characters that are clearly hicks and rednecks and blah 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 yada yada yada. You know, the stereotypical country out in the wasteland type people. So she might not necessarily sound that way naturally. Even so, hope you'll come back for the next chapter. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and release a chapter on Monday and a chapter on Friday. So there will be 2 chapters a week. Okay? 2 chapters a week. Monday and Friday. Because there's 20 chapters altogether, and I feel like 10 weeks is probably more than enough time to build up interest in my book. And hopefully there is interest. Thank you again. Stay safe. And I look forward to bringing you more productions in the future that hopefully will be just as entertaining. More so, even. And take care of yourselves. And I'll talk to you next time. I'll see you next time. Peace. If you think I should have a certain close off or something like that, just let me know. I am not entirely certain how to close things off. All I've been doing is saying, "Hey, peace," and I don't know that really holds a lot of weight at the end of my videos anymore. But I don't know. I don't know. Like Bowser says, I don't know. It's just one of those things that we got to figure out. I don't know. I love his videos. I love them. They're great. Anyhow, you let me know if you think I should have a close off something. Go ahead, comment below, share your thoughts and opinions. But for now, thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and peace out. I'll talk to y'all later.